Man alone gave a blanket to the native girl on a cold night. The next day, gold was found on his property. The first flakes of snow began falling just as Thomas Whitmore finished hammering the last board into place on his cabin wall. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the dropping temperature, and surveyed his modest homestead. 3 months of backbreaking work had transformed this patch of Montana wilderness into something resembling civilization. The single-room cabin stood sturdy against the approaching storm, its chimney already sending thin wisps of smoke into the darkening sky. What Thomas didn't know was that in exactly 18 hours, his life would change forever. Not because of the storm brewing overhead, not because of the wolves he could hear howling in the distance, but because of a simple act of human kindness that would reveal something extraordinary buried beneath his feet. The wind picked up, sending the fresh snowfall swirling in violent patterns across the clearing. Thomas gathered his tools and headed inside, grateful for the warmth radiating from his stone fireplace. He had built everything himself, every log carefully chosen and positioned, every joint fitted with the precision of a man who understood that in this wilderness, shoddy work meant death. At 33, Thomas had seen enough of the world to know its cruelties. The Civil War had taken his brother, consumption had claimed his wife, and a business partnership gone wrong had cost him everything he had built back in St. Louis. This remote homestead represented his last chance at starting over. 160 acres of government land that he could claim under the Homestead Act if he could prove it up for 5 years. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, the closest town a full day's ride through treacherous mountain passes. Thomas had chosen this isolation deliberately. People brought complications, and he had endured enough complications for one lifetime. He prepared a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, the same meal he had eaten for the past week. Supplies were running low, but he had enough to last through winter if he was careful. The trading post in Bear Creek would have to wait until the snows melted in spring. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the gaps in the mountains, carrying with it the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't prepared. Thomas added another log to the fire and settled into his handmade chair with a cup of coffee, listening to the familiar sounds of the wilderness night. That's when he heard something different, something that didn't belong. A sound barely audible above the storm, rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps crunching through snow. Thomas set down his coffee and reached for the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace. In this country, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. Thomas waited, finger on the trigger, heart hammering against his ribs. 3 soft knocks echoed through the cabin, so quiet he almost missed them over the wind. He approached the door cautiously, rifle ready. Through the gaps between the logs, he could see a dark figure huddled against the storm. "Who's there?" Thomas called out. No response. Just the relentless howling of the wind. Thomas lifted the wooden bar from across the door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. What he saw made him lower his weapon immediately. A young Native American woman stood on his threshold, her long black hair whipping around her face in the wind. She wore traditional buckskin clothing that provided little protection against the blizzard, and her lips had already turned blue from cold. She couldn't have been more than 18 years old. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held no fear, only exhaustion and resignation. She didn't speak, didn't beg or plead. She simply stood there, waiting for him to decide her fate. Thomas had heard the stories about what happened to lone settlers who showed kindness to wandering Indians. His neighbors back in Missouri had filled his head with warnings about savages and massacres. But looking at this girl, shivering in the doorway of his cabin, all he could see was another human being in desperate need. The decision took less than a second. "Come in," he said, stepping aside and gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment, studying his face in the firelight. Then she stepped across the threshold, bringing with her the scent of pine smoke and leather. Thomas barred the door behind her and turned to find her standing motionless in the center of his cabin, water dripping from her hair onto his wooden floor. She was even younger than he had initially thought, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "Sit by the fire," Thomas said, indicating his chair. "You need to warm up." She remained standing, watching him with the wariness of a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Thomas set his rifle aside and moved to his trunk in the corner of the cabin. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, one of the few personal items he had brought from his old life. It had been his wife's favorite, a deep blue color with intricate patterns woven along the edges. He approached the girl slowly, holding the blanket out to her. "Here," he said softly. "This will help." She looked at the offered blanket, then back at his face. Something in his expression must have convinced her of his intentions, because she reached out and accepted it. The moment the wool touched her skin, she wrapped it tightly around her shoulders and moved closer to the fire. Thomas busied himself preparing another cup of coffee, giving her space to warm herself. When he turned back, she was seated in his chair, the blanket pulled up to her chin, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Thomas heated up the remaining beans and salt pork, adding extra portions to compensate for what he imagined was probably days without a proper meal. He handed her the plate and watched as she ate slowly, savoring each bite. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew more violent. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind threatened to tear the roof from the cabin. Thomas knew that without shelter, the girl would have died within hours. She finished eating and set the empty plate aside. Then she spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Her English was clear but accented, suggesting she had learned it from traders or missionaries. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Ayanna," she replied. "It means eternal blossom." "I'm Thomas Whitmore." She nodded and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her features. "Where were you headed?" Thomas asked. "In this storm?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Away," she said finally, "just away." Thomas understood that kind of desperation. He had felt it himself when he left Missouri, the need to put distance between himself and the ghosts of his past. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "The storm should pass by morning. I have nothing to give you in return," Ayanna said. "I'm not asking for anything." She studied his face in the firelight as if trying to understand what kind of man would offer shelter to a stranger without expectation of payment. Thomas made himself a bed on the floor near the door, giving Ayanna his bed in the far corner of the cabin. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering what circumstances had driven a young woman to brave such weather alone. When he finally drifted off to sleep, the last thing he heard was the soft sound of Ayanna's breathing, steady and peaceful for the first time since she had arrived. Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of absolute silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating a landscape so white and pristine it seemed almost supernatural. He sat up carefully, not wanting to wake his guest, and looked toward the corner where Ayanna had slept. The bed was empty, the blue blanket folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. She was gone. Thomas pulled on his boots and coat and stepped outside. The snow came up to his knees, and the cold air burned his lungs with each breath. He could see footprints leading away from the cabin, heading north toward the tree line. They were already being filled in by wind-blown snow. He stood there for several minutes, blanket in hand, wondering if he had dreamed the entire encounter. But the empty plate on his table and the lingering scent of pine smoke in the air confirmed that Ayanna had been real. Thomas spent the morning digging out his cabin and checking on his animals. The storm had been fierce, but his preparations had held. His horse and 2 cattle had weathered it safely in the small barn he had constructed, and his supplies remained intact. It was while he was splitting firewood behind the cabin that his axe struck something unusual. Instead of the solid thunk of blade meeting wood, there was a different sound, a metallic ring that made his heart skip a beat. Thomas set the axe aside and brushed away the snow and wood chips. There, embedded in what he had thought was an ordinary stump, was a dark rock streaked with veins of unmistakable yellow. Gold. His hands trembled as he examined the specimen more closely. This wasn't fool's gold or some mineral formation that merely resembled the precious metal. This was the real thing, and there was a lot of it. Thomas looked around his property with new eyes. If there was gold here, in what appeared to be a significant vein, then his 160 acres might be worth more than he had ever imagined. But as he knelt in the snow, holding a fortune in his hands, his thoughts weren't on wealth or the comfortable life this discovery could provide. Instead, he found himself thinking about a young woman named Ayanna, and the blue blanket she had folded so carefully before disappearing into the dawn. Over the following days, Thomas explored his property methodically, finding more evidence of the gold vein. It ran in a diagonal line across his land, following what appeared to be an ancient river bed. Conservative estimates suggested there was enough gold here to make him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. But wealth had never been Thomas's primary motivation for coming to Montana. He had sought solitude, a chance to build something with his own hands, away from the complications of civilization. Now, with gold on his property, those complications would inevitably find him. News of gold strikes traveled fast in mining country. Within weeks, his peaceful homestead would be overrun with prospectors, claim jumpers, and all manner of people looking to profit from his discovery. His simple life would become a thing of the past. Thomas spent sleepless nights weighing his options. He could keep the discovery secret, but that was impractical in the long term. Someone would eventually notice his sudden prosperity or stumble across evidence of the gold themselves. He could sell the land and move on, but that felt like running away again, something he had promised himself he wouldn't do. Or he could embrace the change and use his newfound wealth to build something meaningful, something that would honor the memory of the kindness he had shown and received on that stormy night. A week after Ayanna's departure, Thomas made his decision. He would develop the mine, but he would do it responsibly. He would hire local workers, pay fair wages, and ensure that the wealth generated by his land benefited the entire community. And someday, if their paths crossed again, he would find a way to thank the young woman whose presence had somehow brought good fortune to his doorstep. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Thomas Whitmore's gold mine became the talk of the territory. Prospectors and investors flocked to the area, transforming the wilderness into a bustling mining town almost overnight. Thomas maintained control of his operation, using his profits to establish schools, a medical clinic, and proper infrastructure for the growing community. But through all the changes and prosperity that followed, he never forgot the night when a simple act of compassion had changed his life forever. The blue blanket remained folded at the foot of his bed, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable treasures cannot be measured in gold, but in the connections we make with our fellow human beings in moments of desperate need. And sometimes, late at night when the wind howled through the mountains just as it had on that fateful evening, Thomas would find himself listening for the sound of soft footsteps in the snow, hoping that somewhere out there, Ayanna had found the peace and safety she had been seeking when she appeared at his door like an angel in the storm. Years passed, and the mining town of Whitmore Creek flourished beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. What had started as his solitary homestead had grown into a community of over 3,000 people. The main street bustled with activity from dawn to dusk, lined with general stores, saloons, a hotel, and even a small theater where traveling performers entertained the miners and their families. Thomas had built himself a proper house on the hill overlooking the town. a two-story Victorian structure that served as both his residence and the headquarters of the Whitmore Mining Company. From his office window, he could see the entire operation that had grown from that single moment when his axe had struck gold. The mine itself employed nearly 400 men working in shifts around the clock. Thomas had implemented safety measures that were revolutionary for the time, insisting on proper ventilation, structural supports, and emergency procedures that kept accidents to a minimum. His workers were the best paid in the territory, and their loyalty to him was absolute. But success brought complications that Thomas had never anticipated. Mining disputes, claim jumpers, and territorial politics consumed much of his time. Lawyers and government officials made regular pilgrimages to Whitmore Creek, each bringing their own agendas and demands. Thomas found himself longing for the simplicity of his early days on the homestead, when his biggest concern had been splitting enough firewood to last through winter. It was on a particularly difficult day in late autumn, 5 years after his discovery, that Thomas received news that would change everything once again. His foreman, a grizzled veteran named Jake Morrison, knocked on his office door with an expression that immediately put Thomas on alert. "Boss, you need to see this," Jake said, holding a leather pouch in his weathered hands. Thomas opened the pouch and found inside a collection of items that made his breath catch in his throat. There was a piece of blue wool fabric, clearly torn from a larger piece, a small carved wooden figure of a horse, intricate and beautiful in its craftsmanship, and a folded piece of paper with writing in 2 languages, English and what he recognized as a Native American script. "Where did this come from?" Thomas asked. "One of the new workers found it buried near the old cabin site," Jake replied. "Thought you should see it before we cleared the area for the new equipment shed." Thomas unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The English portion was written in the same careful handwriting he remembered from the brief note Ayanna had left on his table that morning 5 years ago. "Thomas Whitmore," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the spirits have guided you to find what I have left behind. The night you gave me shelter, you saved more than my life. You restored my faith that there are still good people in this world, people who help others without expecting anything in return. I am the daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Lakota. My people were forced from our lands, scattered like leaves in the wind. I was running from an arranged marriage to a man who would have used me to gain favor with the white authorities. I expected to die in that storm, and I had made peace with that fate. But you showed me kindness when you had every reason to turn me away. You shared your food, your warmth, your precious blanket without asking who I was or where I came from. In our tradition, such generosity creates a spiritual debt that must be repaid. I knew about the gold beneath your land before I ever knocked on your door. My grandfather was a medicine man who could read the signs in the earth and rocks. He taught me to see what others could not. The yellow metal runs deep through this valley, following the path of an ancient river that once brought life to my people. I could have told you that night, could have claimed a share of what lay beneath your feet, but I wanted your kindness to be its own reward. I wanted you to prosper because you deserved it, not because I had given you information in exchange for shelter. By the time you find this letter, I will be far away, living with relatives in Canada where my people can still practice our old ways. But I will never forget the man who wrapped a stranger in his wife's blanket and asked for nothing in return. Use your wealth wisely, Thomas Whitmore. Build something that honors both your kindness and the land that has blessed you. I know that somewhere in the northern wilderness, a woman named Ayanna remembers you in her prayers every night. The carved horse is a symbol of freedom among my people. May it remind you that true wealth comes not from what we possess, but from what we give freely to others. Thomas read the letter 3 times before setting it down on his desk. The carved horse sat before him, its wooden surface smooth from careful handling, its eyes seeming to hold ancient wisdom. Jake cleared his throat. "There's more, boss." The boys found evidence of an old campsite about a 1/4 mile from where they dug this up. Looks like someone spent considerable time there, watching your place. Fresh signs, too, not more than a few weeks old. Thomas's heart began to race. Fresh signs? Boot prints, remnants of a cooking fire, even some modern supplies cached in the rocks. Whoever it was, they've been keeping an eye on things here for quite some time. That evening, Thomas walked alone to the site Jake had described. The campsite was well hidden among the pine trees, positioned to provide a clear view of both the town and his house on the hill. Someone had been very careful to conceal their presence, but Jake's experienced eye had caught the subtle signs of recent habitation. As Thomas examined the area more closely, he found additional evidence of the mysterious watcher. A pair of moccasins, clearly handmade, left beside a flat rock that had been used as a seat. A small bundle of sage and sweetgrass, tied with sinew in the traditional Native American manner, and scratched into the bark of a nearby aspen tree, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a symbol he recognized from his research into local tribal customs. It was a mark that meant waiting or watching over in the Lakota language. Thomas spent the next several days investigating discreetly, asking questions of his workers and the townspeople about any strangers they might have seen in the area. The responses painted a picture that both excited and unsettled him. Several people reported glimpsing a Native American woman near the outskirts of town, always at dawn or dusk, always alone. She never approached anyone or caused any trouble, but she seemed to appear whenever there was some crisis or difficulty in the community. Old Mrs. Henderson swore the woman had guided her lost grandson back to town during a blizzard the previous winter. A group of miners claimed she had warned them away from a section of tunnel just hours before a cave-in that would have killed them all. The town doctor insisted he had seen her gathering medicinal herbs near the creek, plants that later proved crucial in treating a fever epidemic that swept through the mining camp. Each story was similar in its details. A young Native American woman with long black hair, wearing traditional clothing, appearing at moments of crisis and then vanishing like smoke when help was no longer needed. Thomas realized with growing certainty that Ayanna had never really left. She had been watching over him and his community for years, a guardian angel protecting the man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. The knowledge changed something fundamental in Thomas's perspective on his success and his responsibilities. He began to see his wealth not as a personal achievement, but as a trust that had been placed in his care. The gold beneath his land was not just his fortune to enjoy, but a resource that could be used to honor the generosity of spirit that Ayanna had recognized in him that snowy night. Thomas made a decision that shocked the business community and delighted his workers. He announced the establishment of the Whitmore Creek Foundation, a charitable organization that would use half of the mine's profits to support Native American communities throughout the territory. The foundation would provide education, medical care, and legal assistance to tribes that had been displaced or marginalized by westward expansion. But more importantly, Thomas also announced something that no one expected. He was offering a partnership in the mining operation to representatives of the local Lakota tribe, recognizing their historical connection to the land and their right to benefit from its resources. The decision was controversial and difficult to implement, but Thomas persisted despite opposition from other mining interests and territorial politicians. He knew that somewhere in the wilderness, Ayanna was watching, and he wanted her to see that her faith in his character had been justified. On the anniversary of that fateful storm, exactly 6 years after Ayanna had first appeared at his door, Thomas made a pilgrimage to his original cabin. The structure still stood, though it was now dwarfed by the industrial complex that surrounded it. He had preserved it as a reminder of his humble beginnings and the night that had changed everything. As he approached the cabin in the gathering dusk, Thomas was not entirely surprised to see a figure seated on the steps. Ayanna looked exactly as she had 6 years ago, unchanged by time or hardship. She wore the same buckskin clothing, her long black hair flowing freely around her shoulders. But now she was wrapped in a different blanket, one that was clearly of her own making, woven in traditional patterns with colors that seemed to capture the essence of the Montana sky. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet strength he remembered. "Ayanna," he replied, settling down beside her on the steps. "I wondered when you would come back." "I never really left," she said, confirming what he had already suspected. "I have been watching, making sure that the gift of the earth was being used as it should be." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the lights of Whitmore Creek twinkle in the valley below. The town bustled with life and purpose, a testament to what could be accomplished when prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. "You have done well," Ayanna said finally. "Better than I dared to hope." "I had good guidance," Thomas replied, "even when I didn't know I was being guided." Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her face and making her look even younger than her 24 years. "The foundation you created will help many of my people," she said, "and the partnerships you have offered will heal old wounds that many thought could never be repaired." "It seemed like the right thing to do," Thomas said. "I keep thinking about that night, about how you trusted me when you had no reason to. I wanted to prove worthy of that trust." "You proved that the moment you opened your door," Ayanna replied. "Everything that followed was just confirmation of what I already knew about your heart." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ayanna reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew Thomas's blue blanket. It had been carefully preserved, cleaned, and mended where necessary, but still recognizably the same blanket he had wrapped around her shoulders 6 years ago. "I think it is time to return this," she said, offering it to him. Thomas shook his head. "Keep it. It belongs with you now." "Then let us share it," Ayanna suggested, unfolding the blanket and draping it around both their shoulders. They sat together under the Montana stars, two people whose lives had intersected in a moment of desperate need and grown into something neither had expected. The gold that had made Thomas wealthy seemed less important now than the human connection that had made them, both rich in ways that could not be measured in dollars or ounces of precious metal. And in the town below, the lights continued to shine, a beacon of hope and prosperity built on the foundation of a simple act of kindness, shared between strangers on the coldest night of winter.